let's get into the big topic of open source, something that we actually say at Red Hat.
This is so awesome.
We are an open culture that believes in
What is that process that a developer, or let's say,
as the Kubernetes ecosystem really boomed.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of In the Clouds. I am your host, Stu Miniman. It is hard to believe that we are almost halfway through 2024. Here we are at the end of June. I am super excited to have another guest here in our Boston studio, Brian Stevens, who is no stranger to Red Hat. Brian, great to see you. How are you?
Great to be here. Great to be in the old office.
All right. So for those of you that don't know in the audience, so Brian I first met him. He was the CTO here at Red Hat. Kept in touch with him when he was the CTO over at Google Cloud. Crossed paths with him. He's on the board at Nutanix, who I've done plenty of work with over the years. And now he is CEO of Neurom Magic, Boston-based, came out of MIT. This thing called AI is kind of a big thing, and you're involved, right? Yeah, Brian, just give us the quick, if you would, your journey from Red Hat to Neurom Magic.
From Red Hat.
Yeah.
I mean, Red Hat was probably the best job I've ever had, to be honest. I mean, it's where we had been exposed to open source, but never felt the culture of open source. Mm-hmm. And so at Red Hat, it just embodied it was the culture, it was the technology, it was the products. And so I in many ways, even though I had a lot of tech experience before that, I feel like I grew up at Red Hat, quite honestly, and building great products. And so it was definitely a tearful goodbye in 2014 when I went to Google. But I think for me, it was the opportunity to learn something that I didn't know. And so to actually have the resources of something like Google and in the very beginning of their journey for public cloud was something that was hard to pass up. Yep. And so there it was all around, bringing Google Cloud to the enterprise, something that we at Red Hat knew really well. Sure. But at Google in those days, they wouldn't selling the enterprise was taboo. Sure. So there was only selling to companies without IT departments. So it was a little bit disruptive to them to say we're going to go sell to enterprise. And then the other fun part at Google was really introducing open source to them, because I think they were very much a consumer of open source, but that's very different than becoming part of the community.
Yeah, and it's crazy because you think about there's been some seminal open source technologies that came out of Google. I mean, not just Kubernetes, but go before that with Hadoop and the like. There's a number of pieces, but you're right. It's been documented quite a bit that the relationship is interesting. There's been some awesome community people inside of Google, 100%. And it's ebbed and flowed over the years.
100%. So that was great, and that was a 5-year journey that I was there and just watched the GCP rocket ship and finally provide an alternative to the one incumbent. So it was great. And then left. My dad was actually diagnosed Alzheimer's while I was out living in California, and I just wanted to get back to New Hampshire. And so I came back, and what I say is I made the mistake of meeting a gentleman named Nir Shivat, MIT professor, and he was just captivating. And I'd started all the AI service on cloud 9 years ago, but Nir just had a whole nother dimension about how he thought about AI. And so I fell in love and joined them for 2 years as an advisor. I did not want to be full-time at the time, but then along comes COVID, and I found myself just every day spending with Neurom Magic, and joined full-time 3 years ago as CEO. Okay, and why don't you just give us kind of the quick and dirty on what Neurom Magic does? Yeah. So what Neurom Magic does is it's really a unicorn company, because it's a company that has deep machine learning expertise, but then also HPC expertise. And so what we focus on is how does an enterprise build, resilient enterprise inferencing? And so it starts with, how do you actually optimize the models efficiently? Because nobody deploys the models you see at Hugging Face without trying to optimize them, because they're just too heavyweight and wasteful. And so we're, experts on that side and all the techniques to optimize, and then also building inferencing. And we actually recently switched to an open source basis for our inferencing systems. Okay, that opens up. Let's step back for a second. AI
has been around for a long time.
Right.
I've quoted, when I read the Walter Isaacson book, said that, Ada Lovelace defined 150 years ago, if I can write it in code, it's not artificial intelligence. People like Tim O'Reilly's talked about data scientists and all the stuff they've been doing for decades. At Red Hat, we've had customers doing AI for a long time, but the Gen AI moment, absolutely, a year and a half ago, has culminized a lot of activity. And this year, there's been a lot of conversation about like, we have the, giant models from the big cloud providers like your former employer, Anthropic and OpenAI and the like out there, Claude. But open source, where does that fit in the piece? And of course, we at Red Hat have very specific thoughts as to what is open, and you live through
what
that.
Is open, so quasi open.
Let me open up. What have you been seeing out there? Open source AI. Do they fit? How do they fit? Does this change the way we think about that in general?
So I'd say prior to the moment you're talking about, November of 2022, everything changed. So even though we'd been in existence for 3.5 years prior to that, the models that we always optimized and that enterprises used were already open source. So that by and large, everything was open source, and they were still transformers, something Google invented, but they're all focused on either vision typically or natural language processing or recommendations. So either supporting e-tailers, recommendations, vision at the edge, or in the case of the BERT and transformers, they were doing like summarization of documents, things like that. So that was kind of state of the art, and that's where the industry had been. But it was all open source from a perspective of the model side and the optimization side, and then the deployment side on inferencing was pretty rough. So it was TensorFlow and PyTorch, then turned mostly to PyTorch, but it wasn't very advanced. It was just okay, and then. But what's really happened, I would say November 22, then along shows the world of like, here's a true power, right? Like it was, I say my mom now knows what I do. Right? Because she can see it.
Brian, I had the same thing. It's like, my mother used to read my blogs a decade ago, and she said like, hey, I heard about cloud on NPR. That's the stuff you've been writing about. But the average consumer out there leverages the cloud but never thinks about it, as opposed to AI is like the internet. It's in my pocket, and every single, my kids and everybody else understands and has some touch point to it, which is why, I would say it's one of the reasons why this is, one of those mega waves that is transformational. It is. Because,
So you asked open source. So pre-November 22, like state of the art was open source models, right? Then all of a sudden ChatGPT drops. And, I was asking myself, like, is this an inflection point in the industry where it's all going to be closed and paywall and be competitive? And it was many months we lived in that world. So it was many months that there was a few open source large language models out there, but I'd call them kind of toys. So it's kind of like you and I know, like, you don't want to use open source because it's just okay, right? You don't want to make any, sacrifices. You want it to be better. And that clearly wasn't the case when large language models bust on the scenes. The open source ones were kind of just, so it was kind of I call it some tough days, because I'm in the building company on open source, but also rooting for open source to win, because I think it's just better for everybody. So it went from November 2022 to about March of 2023. I know it's only a year ago, but it seems like it's been 10. So about March, where you started seeing some better open source large language models emerge. And they started emerging only because the big tech companies wanted they still wanted the researchers to engage with their models, but they didn't want people to use them commercially. Well, that lasted about 6 minutes. And so now most of the best large language models are permissively licensed, right? Up in some having variants around. They don't want their cloud their big tech competitors to use them. So if you have 1 billion users on them, for example, then you got to buy a commercial license.
So specifically talking about like, Llama and how they do things, or in Mistral, we all look at things and being like, right, how open is it? So give us a little bit, can you name some models? What do you see out there? And totally understand that in June of 2024, things are changing so fast. I look at from when we at Red Hat Summit unveiled like the Granite model, and that's going to be fully open source from IBM and Red Hat, to 2 months, like a ton has changed.
Yeah.
That
hard to keep up.
ecosystem and landscape, we thought the CNCF landscape was a little bit broad.
A lot of
The
logos.
AI landscape is like as big already,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you know, we're only a year and a half
I
into
think
it.
I was looking at the LFAI, foundation and all the projects that were hosted under that, like open source projects. It's mind-boggling. Model-wise, what's interesting actually this week, a new evaluation criteria emerged.
Okay.
Because it's really important that, just anyway, the model builders, the researchers, enterprises, developers really understand the model's capabilities. And so what's nice is that's a great role for open source, right? So there's an open source evaluation framework that Hugging Face has built, and that builds a leaderboard and it evaluates all the models. So all the marketing in the world doesn't really matter. It's where you are on the leaderboard. But what happened was the first generation of that leaderboard, there's like 6 test criteria, and you run against grade school math, things like that. But all of a sudden, all the models were collapsing at the highest results.
Yeah.
And so either it's because the bar was too low, or because they're training on the data, of which is evaluated against. So a new evaluation criteria came out this week.
Okay.
And I think it was 6 new kind of evaluation frameworks. And it's no longer grade school math. It's like advanced math,
Sure.
As an example.
Yep.
But it's a really robust training framework. So on that, I was just looking at it this morning. The top model that emerged on that is from Alibaba, if I remember right, which is Quen. And then there's the second is the Llama model did really well, the 70 billion parameter Llama model. And then the third, I believe, was Microsoft's Phi. So those are the top 3 on bigger models.
Yeah.
Phi, I think, is a little smaller. Phi might be 15 billion parameters, which is really pretty outstanding. But it's nice because it really helps at least users, enterprise, because they can start with a model that they look great on a bad criteria and not have success with it. And that's a lot of wasted effort.
Yeah. How about the landscape out there? We've had so much focus on LLMs in the early days. I've heard discussion of the small language models because, as I go out to the enterprise, especially, I'm in the telecommunication space. I don't need healthcare data. I need some of the things, or, we've been, those of us in the enterprise space are looking at how do I help fine tune? How does RAG fit into the over discussion? So, back in the early days of cloud was like, are there going to be 1 or 2 winners, or are there hundreds of clouds? And there are, a few big ones, but there's dozens or hundreds of other ones. And from model standpoint, where do we see that? And again, early days, but how's that checking out?
I've heard a lot of people say there's 40,000 models. It's really robust. And I'd argue that 99% of them are obsolete. Right. So it sounds great, but the reality is they're all kind of like odd variants, and you can look for the usage of them.
Sure.
One thing that's helpful is downloads don't really mean a lot in some things, but you can see the convergence. And so it's easy for like a Llama 2 model that was state of the art, 3 months ago.
Right.
Like, I would suspect you're not going to see an enterprise using that already, because you enterprises want to be able to take advantage of the latest innovation. And if the model capability gets better, you don't want to have so much point, investment in a model that you can't bring forward onto, the next platform. So it's really important that people, like, as if they do fine tune, that they build a fine tuning mechanism that they can do on any of the top models. And then in answer to your question around fine tunes, I'm a big believer in small models and fine tunes. Not seeing as much as that as I would have thought, right, already. I think part of it is because while the fine tuning, the ability to fine tune is not that hard, there's still not that many people that know how to do it efficiently. And sometimes the data set's not as easy to kind of put together a high quality data set. So we're seeing kind of in the enterprises that we're engaged with, and all of them are very large global companies that have, machine learning teams. What we're now seeing, and this wasn't true even 3 months ago, is the adoption of larger models, not fine-tuned. So like some of the ones that I said in the 70B range. And the reason why is it's the first time that we've seen open source models, and when they're at the 70B kind of level, that are equal to the best served models from OpenAI and others. And that's kind of profound when you think about it. But what we're finding is enterprises can do that at about an order of magnitude less cost. So all of a sudden, I mean, that's the power of open source, right? Yeah. So think about that. So there are definitely use cases where, just like the ChatGPT use cases, I don't know why I always say that one, but I think they're kind of synonymous, so I'm giving them the props. But there are use cases where you don't need to fine tune based on your use case. I think we all agree, like summarization and all these things that are multi-turn chat sessions and the way companies are using it now, or you're using it with a RAG database. And then we're seeing the other use cases inside the same enterprises that indeed they are fine-tuning instruction models, right? For smaller, and sometimes it's because they want a smaller model, but other times it's just because, like you just said, they want a greater specificity, of the data.
Yeah. So, gosh, I can't believe it was only at the beginning of this year I had, our CEO Matt on, and at the time he was talking about RAG, their fine tuning. I talked about with the Shesh right ahead of Summit because what we've been doing with InstructLab there.
Yeah, it's really cool.
A term we haven't mentioned yet on this program is VLLM. So maybe you can introduce for our audience what that is, how that fits into the overall discussion.
Introduced it because it's just nobody knew about it. So I'm maybe a lot of people have. I'm kind of like living too much in that world, so it's hard for me to understand the other world right now. So we learned about it because what we found was we were only doing CPUs. Right. So we're like, we want to bring AI to the masses, and CPUs are ubiquitous, right? And so all of our work was focused on CPUs and model optimizations to run efficiently on CPUs. And we were great at that. And then what we saw last summer was that with large language models, even GPUs weren't efficient, which is hard to believe because they've got thousands of cores and they're crazy. But what changed was they all became memory bound, because the large models finally were big enough. And we're talking even the 7B parameters, not even the 70Bs, that they became inefficient. And so we saw users using more than one GPU to run one instance server, or have to buy GPUs with bigger memory on them just for that, because they couldn't saturate the cores. So we looked at that and said, that's right in our wheelhouse, from the HPC side of us to the model optimization side. So we said, we're going to jump in. We had a decision to make. Do we build yet another proprietary engine for that? Do we just focus on the NVIDIA stack, which was half open, half closed, and do the optimizations there? Or do we start something new as an open source project? And so then 1 year and 2 weeks ago, this coming Friday, some amazing PhD candidates at Berkeley, same Jan Stoka's lab, same thing that Spark came out of, and Databricks, had really just begun with this project called VLM, and it was an implementation of page attention. And what page attention is an implementation of what's called a KB cache, and all the stuff we had built in CPUs already, because we had added large language models to our CPUs. And so every inference request has a cache inside of the thing. So it's really important. Their LLMs process completely differently, but they had started and built a really great implementation of a research paper that was out there. And we said, from roots, like, let's jump into that one. Let's engage and build the most amazing open source inference server on the planet. And so we jumped into this nascent project, last fall. My board was kind of like, what are you doing? I'm like, trust me. And we just went all in, and we just added so much capability to it, and part of a community that was working on it, and performance. And then and now that was last June, and now here we are a year later, and VLM in the community that is the AI and ML has become, in my opinion, the de facto open source inference server. But importantly, as we talked about before, with zero apologies as far as its capabilities relative to closed stacks on NVIDIA. Yeah. And so that's in 1 year, right? Yeah. That's the power of collaboration, the power of open source. And because I think we jumped in so fast, and we had all the expertise before, it's a robust community, but the last number of releases, we've been the top developer of it. Yeah. And so we're just tickled, because it reminds us a lot like how, and
it's interesting because, I sit near a bunch of people working on the AI technology, but when I turn on the financial news,
they're not talking about
the only thing they talk about is who's selling the picks and shovels? It's NVIDIA.
Yeah.
There's supply chain issues, but when I talk to customers, they talk about, what do they buy in the cloud? What do they do in their data center? And it's, GPU, GPU, GPU. And, NVIDIA's buying Run AI. There's pieces of how do we do this? But, we are still in the very early days of this kind of technology. And I think back to previous generations of technology, and this shows a lot of promise because, it's like, the cloud gave us unlimited CPU utilization. In theory, you paid for it, but you spin up. And in the data center, we've always had constrained resources. So if I have a little bit more flexibility as to what I'm using,
oh my gosh, yes.
And some of the things, when I hear some people on the outside watching, it's like AI, not only isn't it inexpensive, but oh my God, the power usage and what do we do here?
Which is true.
There's challenges here. So it sounds like VLM helps address some of these concerns.
Yeah, just the fact, what I was saying, that one enterprise that found that it was 10x cheaper for running equivalency of capability inside. Right. So right there, right, is power savings and giving, it's going to be able to be used more pervasively, right? Not a scarce resource if it's 10 times cheaper. Right. And when you think about that, then you'll do the other enterprise aspects is now all of a sudden there'll be more prevalent use because so many are concerned about, data privacy, they don't want to send their training data, to cloud. They're unsure of what the public models were trained on. So there's a lot of reasons for privacy and security. They also can control their life cycle now. I mean, if you can really build the models in the cloud roll out without your awareness, and a lot of things get better and a lot of things get worse. So you can't really QA them because you're not part of the QA release process. But so we're seeing enterprises that love open source LLMs on VLM because then they now control the model rollout. They can lock down on old releases and then their new cases move forward. But even with that 10x improvement, like one client that we're working on, and they've got a big tech team and they're a big e-tailer. And then just to be able to come in and make their usage 90% more efficient, 90%. So the first week, I think we got it to 1.4x. This is all on A100s, NVIDIA. And then the next week we got it to 1.9x more efficient. So if you think about that, and that's actually says two things. One is an open source inference server on NVIDIA hardware, and it's 1.9x better than they're able to achieve. But think of that from a power consumption and savings as well. And it actually allows them to run on smaller GPUs from NVIDIA as well. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, but Brian, I don't have to tell you, your experience at Red Hat, my time here working through the industry, customers end up with a lot of different environments. So while today NVIDIA is one of the main pieces, a huge important partner, I'm going to have, different resources in different places with different type of technology. I know from an AI standpoint, there's the competitors that are looking to get share from NVIDIA as well as, make sure that there's pricing flexibility and things like that. So can you speak a little ecosystem, I guess, is what we want to talk.
That was why
it sounds like NVIDIA is not opposed to this activity, even though it could lessen their, their position in the market.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have really strong aspirations on software revenue. I mean, Jensen said that on his last call, which makes sense. I mean, they've got a lot of really smart people on the software side. And I did see, you did see saw this on the financial news, even they're covering it, there's a lot of innovation happening in hardware, but they don't have a software stack. So it's really hard. Remember, the reason why I fell in love with Linux was because the same thing was happening. God, I'm sort of dating myself, but in the Unix markets, when Cisco built a great platform, and enterprise wouldn't use it because they were an HP shop, because too much changed about the stack. All the ecosystem changed. So that's why, when we chose to invest in VLM, we wanted permissive license, right? And we wanted it to be cross-platform, and we wanted it to be a project where they would welcome contributions. And it's turned out to be all that. So now with VLM, we're already seeing all the hardware partners that have GPUs and ASICs integrate. So AMD's actively integrating into VLM. Intel's actually integrating GPUs and CPUs into VLM because it'll support CPUs as well in the future. AWS is adding inferential support. Google's adding TPU support. So all of a sudden, but that's, you're going to have this VLM that it won't churn the customer stack.
Yep.
Like think about that. You've got inferencing systems built on VLM and open source models, and it's great if your choice is NVIDIA, it's going to be great. But if you want to add, hardware from AMD, you can do that without any changes anywhere else. And that reminds me of what we aspired to and did at Red Hat. And I think that's really valuable to people.
Yeah. Where's Red Hat fit into this equation of VLLMs from your viewpoint?
From VLM, well, Red Hat's, got an amazing capability, with RHEL from the platform side, as we talked about. And then they have amazing capability around Kubernetes and OpenShift and how do you scale services. And Red Hat's recently started shipping VLM as well as part of their products, right? And so the part we focus on is being experts in VLM and experts in open source models and optimization of them. But then what you want to do though is, and that gives you the most efficiency out of single server. But then the next step of that is you want to be able to build robust model services that are resilient and auto scale up, scale back. Yeah. And so that's where like the integration of VLM with something like OpenShift and specifically this project called Kserve.
Yep.
And that's like the integration point between the two. And that's what enterprises are going to need.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure we've got folks working on Kserve.
A lot of people on Kserve.
And I've heard from our OpenShift AI team that there's roadmap for where VLM fits into.
Yeah. I think Red Hat definitely sees this correctly.
Yeah. Awesome. What haven't we covered from kind of the VLLM open source? Yeah. It's fast moving, Brian.
Yeah.
So I guess when you're talking to users out there, there's a line I've used. It used to be, I should have started a project a year ago, but I didn't, so I should start it now. Yeah. And for the last 5 years, I've said, if I could wait another 6 to 9 months, I'd probably be better off, but I need to get started now. Yeah. So what advice do you have for practitioners out there?
Yeah. I think like well, maybe I'll do a little bit around like the types of engagements we have, and maybe that'll shed some light on like use cases and what people are doing. I thought that even though we had moved to an open source VLM, and because it's young, it's a year old. I thought, and because the enterprises are all on, not all, but all on NVIDIA, I thought we would have to come in with VLM, introducing it for the first time. Yep. So yes, it's open source, but for all practical considerations, it's new to them, so it might as well be proprietary. Right. Because we said you can't sell on the merits of open source, you got to sell on the value, that is created. To be honest, and we just started this like 8 weeks ago because we waited till VLM got to a point that we were ready. And then what we found in like a number of engagements we're in, they're already using VLM. Like already using VLM. Yeah. Like it's a year, and they're using it on NVIDIA. And one like really large gaming company said that today VLM they found for their use case was 10 to 15% slower than NVIDIA stack, but it was 10x easier for their developers to use. Wow. Right?
Yeah.
Like that, I'd rather have that. Yeah. I'd rather always be 10% slower and easier to use. But guess what? Yeah. It's not going to be 10 to 15% slower. Sure. In 6 months, it's going to be 50% faster. Right. And so we're seeing that. We're seeing another case, a large media and entertainment company that is already, we're working with to build like resilient model services, because they're already like, okay, game over. Now we got to build a shared services platform. It's true, AI is like other APIs that you do, but it's more difficult because there's accelerators involved and it's harder to auto scale. But they're already building resilient model services on VLM. Another one, as we said, a lot of times they want to optimize the models without losing accuracy. That's one way we help them, and that's what gets them the efficiency. And then another one was just another large company. They're so far along with VLM that they want, I'll call it the Red Hat capability around it, which is what we're doing in this case, where, as upstream releases come out, we branch them and harden them because, enterprises don't, as right, they don't want to have to roll forward to get the next fix or even the next model. Sure. So, and they're already, I was kind of surprised, they're already on multiple versions of VLM with models in production. And then you want to leave that there, and so that's what they're doing. And then they're on to the next, but then they're seeing performance variations and things like that. So I'd say at least at the large enterprise, it really bodes well, for the future of VLM and open source, right? So I think we got something to cheer about. I don't really see any alternatives to it out there, either commercially, or OpenWise. So I think that's good. And I think now it's time to build the ecosystem around it.
Yeah. Yeah. Speak to the ecosystem, like how many companies contributing to VLLM?
Yeah, we do. The stats are public. So the Berkeley team does a quarterly, meeting. They're usually in California. We're trying to get one out here. And they talk about like who's contributing to it. So I think, like I said, like the top commercial contributor companies have been ourselves and Anyscale. Anyscale is a company that came out of the Berkeley labs as well, and they build on an open source project that they created at Berkeley called Ray. So it's kind of an alternative to Kubernetes, if you will. But they're a really big contributor. And what I love about it was, so we were just doing this thing called FP8, so floating point 8 quantization. And so to do that, you by default models are FP16, right? And so people run in production. So we did FP8 working with Anyscale, and because you reduced the precision but kept the accuracy, you're seeing model speedups of inference speedups of 50% to 100%. But it's kind of cool, like that. There's a lot of commercial collaboration. It doesn't all happen, as you know, like out on like the public channels. There aren't really good public channels, but there's a lot of ways. We're working with Intel on them getting their CPU support, and so there's a lot of good commercial activity. And then obviously the Berkeley team is a big contributor of it. And then there's a really good long tail, though, right, of contributors to VLM as well. And so we know like that's really important.
All right. Well, Brian, we've reached the point. We've got a rapid fire segment we'd like to help bring us home. So, Rohan. All right, so it is questions from the Red Hat. I did not bring the physical Red Hat in person, but Brian, I know it's tough sometimes, big brains like you to keep a short answer, but let's start with the first one. You're at a startup now, entrepreneurial. So what are some entrepreneurial skills that you would like to share and encourage others?
For me, like a lot of times it's been mentoring. Like a lot of times at startups, there's people that are earlier in their careers because there's less risk when you're early in your career. So there's like strong academics, but there's a lot of mentoring required, right? Both at individual contributors as well as mentoring for managers.
All right, thank you. Next one. So we mentioned, you were at Red Hat, for a while. Give us, what's your view of Red Hat now from outside compared to when you were inside?
I'm proud, so like I think Matt was saying or maybe it was Chris, there's like 20,000 employees, and I'm like, I'm just tickled. When I left, I just wanted to always look back at this as being a fond memory. I made sure I never hired one person out from Red Hat, even when I went to Google, because I just wanted to see Red Hat thrive. And I was worried, when IBM bought Red Hat, culture change and otherwise, but it seems like that's been managed extremely well. And Red Hat is just, I think it's got an amazing brand and amazing contributor to communities. And I just never would have expected 2001 when I joined that it could be anything close to what it is today.
Yeah, it is amazing. Harken back, you were talking about customers like in the back using VLLM. I remember 2001 talking to customers and it's like, hey, do you use Linux? And they're like, no, we don't. And they're like, hold on, Bob and Jim and those guys in the back, the people that there was always somebody in the back, and watched it go from that back thing that we don't talk about to, come on, we wouldn't have Google if it wasn't for Linux. So we wouldn't have so many of the companies that are there.
We always called that Joe's Linux back in those days.
It was just called Joe's. That's there. All right, last one for you. We talked about how fast everything is changing here in AI. What do you foresee our perception of AI changing this year?
Oh, the perception of AI changing this year. It's there's not enough time for it on the rapid side. The thing that worries me the most is we definitely need controls and regulation, yet at the same time, controls and regulation can make us uncompetitive, the US that is. So that's where I think there's a huge opportunity, to be honest, for open source to come in from ethics and safety perspective.
It's interesting. I love your follow-up on that, because I had a couple of customers speak at Red Hat Summit from the Nordics, from Latin America, where you have public, private, and research all working together, and government helping to fund that. And that's something that we don't see in the US.
Not quite in that state right now, are we?
I think how do we balance? You want the innovation to grow, but you want to make sure you're protected.
I think it's being responsible. So I think you want the innovation to grow unrestrained, right? And then if it's only going to grow unrestrained, if the ones that are putting the most energy into it also have economic benefit, so you want to allow them to have economic benefit, so the investment still comes in. But at the same time, I'd argue the responsibility on the big tech companies, they shouldn't be the only ones to bear the burden of safe AI. And I think that's why, just like we talked about this new ELMS, one example, the ELMSys, leaderboard, what's it evaluating for? How good it can summarize a document? How well does it know math? Like how can it reason? But there should equally be frameworks there that test score a model on ethics, diversity, right? Safety, right? And that's right in the wheelhouse, like of open source. And we can score models on the things that matter.
All right, Brian Stevens, thank you so much. A pleasure to catch up. Thank you for sharing with the community. Give you the last word. How do people get involved in VLM more? What should we be seeing from Neurom Magic later this year?
Yeah, I mean, just really, it's the search engine optimization around VLM really good. So just search for VLM, get involved as a contributor. Neurom Magic and the Berkeley team host bi-weekly office hours, so you can come and get introduced there and ask questions. Come to neuromagic.com. There's a lot of ways, and if you're smart, you'll find them.
Yeah, awesome stuff. Yeah, the office hours, it was actually cross paths with Brian. He was doing one of the office hours from here in the Seaport office of Red Hat, and we reconnected and said, hey, come on the program. So Brian, pleasure to chat with you always, and thank you for sharing with the community. All right. A reminder from In the Clouds, we will have another episode in 2 weeks talking about the latest version of OpenShift. And as always, your feedback is welcome. What guests should we cover and what topics should we cover? This is In the Clouds. We're trying to not make it all AI, but there's been a lot of that obviously lately. So thank you, as always, for joining us on your journey in the clouds.